So tonight we're going to be talking about merit badge cards from 1911 to 1944. It was really too much to cover all of them in detail from 1911 to present day. And I really have to think a lot of this research was done by Ron Oslin, and Tim Mullaney put it into a really nice PDF document, which will be in the video description. So if you want to access it, you can access it that way. But I could not have possibly started collecting these to this level of detail without all the work that they did. So first, I want to kind of discuss some of the early leadership of the Boy Scouts, because as you'll see, a lot of the kind of the story and behind the merit badge cards and why there are different merit badge cards, it has to do with the leadership of the Boy Scouts. So first, in 1910, you had Edgar Robinson, who was credited as the co-founder of BSA. He was the first secretary of the Boy Scouts. At the time, he was working for the YMCA, and he started doing with the Boy Scouts. John L. Alexander, he was the second secretary of the BSA. He was also in the YMCA with Robinson. And then you had James E. West. He was the third secretary of the BSA, and he became the first Chief Scout Executive when he renamed the position. So you had Colin H. Livingston, and it was kind of interesting. I'd seen the name Livingston before, but I didn't really know anything about him. And he was kind of pulled in as the first president of the BSA because he was at a meeting with Robinson, a bunch of the other influential members at the beginning of the movement, and they wanted somebody to be charged. And he was a banker from Washington, D.C., and his name was on the May 10th, 1910 bill to Congress that was about the Boy Scouts forming and everything. So because his name was on the bill, and he was the only one at the meeting with his name that was on the bill, he was kind of put in charge. So, but that at least tells you who some of these people are. You'll probably know Daniel Carter Beard. He was another person that was attributed as a co-founder of the BSA. He was National Scout Commissioner from 1910 to 1941. Ernest Thompson Seton, again, another one of the co-founders of the BSA. Chief Scout 1910 to 1914. He was the only Chief Scout. Now, James E. West was the first Chief Scout Executive, but in the position of Chief Scout, he was the only one in the whole movement. Mortimer L. Schiff, he was executive board from 1910 to 1931, first international commissioner. I thought it was really interesting. When you look at the early finances of the Boy Scouts, the movement didn't have a whole lot of money. And in fact, they were making things in the beginning and making commitments that essentially they were making just on the promise that they would pay people. They just had no money. And so, Boyce in 1910, he provided the Boy Scouts with $2,000, and Mortimer Schiff, he provided $1,000 in 1910, which I thought was kind of interesting. Now, this is getting into some of the signatures on these early cards from 1911 and 12, and kind of into that period, into the teens. So there's two names that most people probably don't know, and one is A.R. Forbush, and the other one's M.B. Sackett. I cannot find hardly any information on A.R. Forbush or M.B. Sackett. Now, I have not done massive in-depth research, but if you do have information on them, I'd love to hear about it. I found this one article from the 4th annual report where it talks about the local council at Worcester, Massachusetts, has upon recommendation of the field department recently secured the services of Mr. A.R. Forbush, formerly Deputy Field Scout Commissioner at National Headquarters. So we know 13, because the annual reports came out the following year, if I remember right. That gets me a little confused, to be honest. But so we know around that time, A.R. Forbush has left National, and he has gone to the council level. Now, here's a big photo, and this is from a much later 1918, the 8th annual report. And I circled it in red there for you, is M.B. Sackett, and he's listed as the Deputy Field Scout Commissioner, which is the same position as A.R. Forbush, okay? But so basically, we know A.R. Forbush left, And the official title of the position he was in, MB Sackett, he had that position title too. Okay. Now, there is an article, and I probably should have included it, but it talks about A.R. Forbush meeting Scoutmaster Sackett in Ohio at a banquet. And it was talking about the banquet and just local scouting stuff. I am assuming, because that's a pretty uncommon name, Sackett's fairly uncommon and A.R. Forbush is fairly uncommon, that I'm assuming that that's when they met. And that was about 1912, or early 1912. So that's kind of the primer. The only other things I have found is that there was one article that talked about A.R. Forbush as the Secretary of the National Council of Honor. So that was who, the National Council of Honor, that was who was giving out merit badge cards, ranks, all of that kind of stuff. Now, I believe that the National Council of Honor operated kind of like a committee with these deputy field commissioners being on the committee, possibly in different roles. That's why we see his official title as that deputy field commissioner, and then you see MB Sackett taking on that same role. I think that they just ended up, that was kind of a committee working under them. So first on the left, you have a 1911 merit badge card. And the big clue, other than the date, is that it has A.R. Forbush Secretary signature. Now, that is the only card with his signature. Starting in 1912, all the cards for that period are signed MB Sackett. Now, in 1916, this card, well, it's attributed to 16, but it has crossed out in black where it says Ernest Thompson Seton, Chief Scout. So that's been crossed out. You'll notice, by the way, there's some nomenclature here where it says MBC 1-1-01. If you've seen some of our other presentations on merit badges and ranks, you may recognize that. In this case, it means merit badge card. So the 1 is for the 19th century. So it's, you kind of think century, decade, and then the 1 in that period of the decade. Does that make sense? So because it's a 1911 card, it's 1-1. Because it's in the teens, so it's the 1, and then because the first card in the teens, it's a 0-1. Personally, and all of this is coming straight from Ron's research, I'm a little confused about the 1916 card, just because if we go to the next slide, Seton resigned in 15. So I would have thought that it would have been maybe a year earlier, but the card is dated 17. So I'm not sure. It's a little confusing, to be honest. Now, the next card, so we've had Seton's name blacked out, and the next one, which is attributed to 1917, it's been completely removed. So they've removed Ernest Thompson Seton's name from the card. Only Beard and West are left on the card. And then a big change happened in 1918. James E. West starts signing the cards. So MB Sackett signed all the cards from 1912 through 1917. 1918, James E. West starts signing. I believe these cards are a typo. If you look at the last line before they list what the actual merit badge is, it says, who has satisfactorily met all of its requirements for the merit badge I, and then it would have the name of the merit badge. That is supposed to read in. So the next card, they corrected it and changed the spacing a little bit. So it says, who has satisfactorily met all the requirements for the merit badge in, and then it names the merit badge. That's the most noticeable change, other than some slight spacing differences. Now notice on this card, which was 1919, where it has the N before the merit badge name, the date is 191, that's printed, and then a line where you would fill in. Obviously, they had to change that on the next card. On this card, they had to actually do 19 and then a space, because it changed from, instead of 191, they had to be able to do 1920, so they'd have to do a 2. So that card was used from 1920 to 1921. This was the last one that James E. West signed So Warren G. Harding was the 29th president of the United States, 1921 to 23, and he passed away in office. Now, Calvin Coolidge was the 30th president of the United States from 1923 to 1929. Why is this pertinent? Well, because this is when we start to see presidents' names as the honorary president of the Boy Scouts of America. We start to see their names showing up on the cards, okay? So you see in 1922 to 23, the design of the card is completely changed. No longer at the bottom is it, Beard's name and West and then the secretary's signature. Instead, you'll see these printed signatures. There were probably a couple reasons for this, but a pretty big reason, I'm sure, is that by the 20s, they were issuing so many more merit badge cards than they were earlier. I'm sure that they wanted to take the burden off of National having to sign every merit badge card and having to deal with all of them. They really wanted to start pushing that to the council level. So that's why you see it says Honorary President Harding. This is the only card with Harding's signature on it because he passed away in 23, which meant they had to change it. I don't have a picture of a card with Coolidge. From my understanding, it would be essentially the same card. It would just have the Coolidge signature instead of Harding. Now, at the bottom of the card, you'll notice it says Livingston Beard West. Who signed the card kind of authorizing it was the Scout Executive or Scout Commissioner and the Scoutmaster. So once again, you're pushing it more towards the council level issuing these cards as opposed to National having to manage them all. Oh, and you'll notice Taft is on there as an honorary vice president. So they started putting, if it was a past president of the United States, they started making him an honorary vice president on the cards. So 1924 to 26. So if you look at the card on the left, Honorary Vice President McAdoo is added to the card. But so that card, you see it has a Coolidge signature, but McAdoo's been added. It's a different design than the Harding design. Now 1925, Honorary Vice President Wilson is removed from the card. They had to print a new card because the former President Wilson had passed away February 24th, 1924. Now, James J. Storrow was elected president of the BSA in 1925. So remember, Storrow is replacing Livingston, who's been president of the Boy Scouts since 1910. So this was a pretty big deal since Livingston had been in the position for 15 years at that point. So you see James Storrow on the card. Livingston's name is moved to the upper level as an honorary vice president. Okay. The problem is that James J. Storrow passed away about a year later. So after James J. Storrow passes away, Milton Alexander McRae replaces him as president of the Boy Scouts from March 1926 until May 1926. Now, there are cards that have the McRae signature replacing the Storrow signature. You can imagine they're fairly difficult since they only would have printed those cards during that 2 to 3 month period. So I don't know my Boy Scout president's history well enough. I don't know if he was elected or appointed as president as kind of an interim position, or if he thought he was going to be in the position longer. I'm not sure, but it was kind of odd to me that he was in the position for such a short amount of time. After he left, Walter William Head comes in as president of the Boy Scouts 1926. President Head, he stuck around for quite a while. In 1928, there was another big change. The address changed. So you'll see on the 1926 to 28 card, it says headquarters 200 Fifth Avenue, New York. On the next card, you'll see headquarters 2 Park Avenue, New York. Once again, when you look at these cards, you see all the signatures and everything else about the card, and you start realizing how many different little pieces go into making the whole. Anytime any one of those pieces changed, whether it was National changing their headquarters address or the passing away of one of the National officers that are on the cards, whenever that happened, they had to make a new card. That's why we have all these varieties. Now, Herbert Hoover was the 31st president of the United States. He served from 1929 to 1933. So that's why you see Honorary President Hoover replaces Coolidge on the card, and that's the 1929 card. You'll notice designation MBC 1-2-10. Now, the next two cards, I don't think these are national cards. They're listed as national cards, and they sure look like them, but I don't think they are. And there's a pretty convincing reason when you kind of consider them. The Scout Executive name is printed. It is not filled in by hand. It is printed on the card. My theory is that the council took some national cards, specifically the MBC 1-2-10, took it to a local print shop and say, hey, how cheap can you make these for us? And the print shop said, oh, we can make them for this, which probably beat National's price. And Scouts being thrifty, they said, oh, great, make them up. And so you got this kind of, it's a nice-ish looking card, but they went ahead. The Scout Executive did not want to sign every merit badge card being issued, so he had his signature added to the card when it was printed. The next one, it has none of the national signatures on the card. That could be a mistake by the printer that they said, well, we'll just keep them and use them. Or it could have been a choice they made because National had to change the card every couple years. Maybe the council wanted to order some, said, you know what, we'll just take them blank. We don't want to have to keep up with signatures and everything. We'll probably never know. But with the Scout Executive signature being printed on the card, that really, to me, solidifies it as a council issue, not a national issue. So 1930 to 32, that time period brought some changes. So first you have Honorary Vice President Taft. His name is removed from the card. That is because former President Taft passed away March 8, 1930. Now in 1931, there's a more or less minor change. And previously it said Scout Executive or Scout Commissioner. That was who would sign off on the left side of the card. The right side, the Scoutmaster signed off. The Scout Commissioner part of who would sign it off has been removed. So now it's just Scout Executive and Scoutmaster. Now, Mortimer L. Schiff is elected president of the BSA in 1931. However, Mr. Schiff passes away June 4th, 1931. So, his time in office is very small. However, there's a card made. It is issued. You have to remember when these were mailed out, if the council's got them, they probably continued to use them even if he had passed away. National just was not producing any more at that point. There's also a small change on the right. Scoutmaster is replaced with Chairman, Local Court of Honor. So Schiff came in and replaced Head. After Schiff passed away, Head had to come back. He came back to his job as president of the Boy Scouts of America. And that's why you see his signature showing up on the card again. You'll also see that the seal was updated. The seal read Headquarters New York. On the next card, they updated the seal to say National Council, New York City. So that was the 1932 card. From 33 to 34, Honorary President Roosevelt replaces Hoover. That's because Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected the 32nd President of the United States and served 33 to 45. Hoover replaces Coolidge as Honorary Vice President. That was due to Coolidge passing away. He passed away January 5th, 1933. So in 1934, these cards, they got funky. They were trying to mess with the typeset and they were trying to move around the date line and stuff. So on the 1934 card, there is no date line. So they made those, they issued them, and I guess somebody realized, hey, maybe this thing that's awarding something that's earned, maybe it needs to have somewhere you can put the date on it. So then they turned around and in 1934, same year, they changed it. Well, this is the problem. They put badge in, space, on, space, day off, space. They didn't leave enough room for the merit badge titles. You can't fit all, some of those merit badge titles are pretty long. You cannot fit them all on there. It just didn't work. So they turned around. The next time they said badge in and they left a hole all the way across the rest of the card. They left a blank for the merit badge title to make it long enough for all the titles. And then they said on, blank, day of, blank. So that was just all moving around, messing with dates and everything. And then they turned around and they said, we really don't like any of the previous cards we've done, so let's change it again. So they made one line that just has the fill-in point for the merit badge title, and they put the date. They kind of moved it back up to the upper right-hand side, closer to where it was in the beginning. And they used that card for a number of years from 1936 to 1940. Then you had a couple more changes. In the 1940 to 41 MBC 1-4-01 card, the difference there is that Chairman Committee on Advancement replaces Chairman Local Court of Honor. So that's that signature in the lower right hand, who would sign the card. Remember, it was Scoutmaster, then Chairman Local Court of Honor. Now it's Chairman Committee on Advancement. Daniel Carter Beard, he passes away June 11th, 1941. And William Gibbs McAdoo passes away February 1st, 1941. And the next card is removing McAdoo from the card. And that's the card that's attributed to the 41 to 43 time period. Notice, even though it's attributed to 41, McAdoo passed away first, so they made this card. Beard is still on this card. Williams Gibbs McAdoo, I would love someone to actually know what his role in scouting was. I can find nothing on what his role in scouting was. He was on the cards from the 20s all the way up until his death. He was not a president. He was on the cards. He was an honorary vice president, which, as you've seen, most of those people there were a couple like Livingston, but most of them were presidents of the United States. But McAdoo was not. If I'm remembering right from when I was putting this together, McAdoo was Secretary of Treasury, and he married the president at the time. He married that president's daughter, and he was going to run for president in 1920. He did not run for president in 1920 because he didn't want to run against his father-in-law, who was running for re-election. But it's still, his name is very odd that his name is on the card. His father-in-law's name is not on the card. That president's name is not on any of the cards, but his name is. I don't know. And I can't find anything about his role in scouting. So kind of an odd one. Now, the next card, remember, so Beard had passed away in later than McAdoo in 41. So National Scout Commissioner Beard is removed from the card. This card's attributed to coming out in 43. So that would have been 2 years after Beard passed away. I wouldn't be surprised if it turned out it actually came out a little earlier. That seems a little late to me with how quick they were flipping cards around. Now, the next one that was from 43 to 44. It says Chairman Court of Honor replaces Chairman Committee on Advancement. Once again, this is that on the right-hand side of the card, you're replacing what was originally Scoutmaster and has gone through several changes at this point. And Chief Scout Executive Festwell replaces West. So this is the second Chief Scout Executive of the Boy Scouts of America, and it's Festwell, and now he's replaced West on the card. Honorary Vice President Livingston is removed from the card because he passed away February 1st, 1943. James E. West retired in 44. He passed away May 15th, 1948, so only 4 years after he retired from the Boy Scouts. So that was my effort to be quick going through all the cards. I hope that a lot of what you took away from that was that the different cards really speak to kind of the history of the movement. Now, the next part of this, I'm going to kind of go into couple little details, and I'm sure some of you are wondering, okay, that was a lot of information to throw at us. So which cards are the ones we need to keep our eyes out? Which ones are the rare ones? It's pretty simple, right? Well, I made up this nice little pie chart, and I just want to show these are quantities of merit badges issued 1911 to 21. It was 20,000 roughly. 22 to 33, you're talking over 200,000. 34 to 44, over 360,000. 45 to 55, you're talking over 450,000. So you can see that kind of represent on the right that the early teens period is a very small bit of all really the first 50 years of our movement. So I would certainly say the older cards, just based on how many were issued in each year, that they're going to be much harder to find than the newer cards. But it really gets more complicated than that. So if we're collecting these national cards and we're trying to figure out which ones are rare, you have to realize, even if you look at how many of a merit badge were issued, let's say first aid, I want to collect first aid cards. Well, if I want to collect certain ones, I can look at how many first aid merit badges were issued that year. However, there are going to be less cards than first aids were issued. And part of that is due to council custom cards. Councils were making their own cards in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and they exist in various sizes, various designs. I'm sure cost was somewhat of an issue, but they also they liked having their own stuff, and they're very cool. These are certainly something you can collect. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about them. Here during the Depression years, here's an example on the right, which I thought was really cool, of a troop that had handwritten cards. And I have several examples from that troop of they hand wrote every card. I would never want to be the one having to do that as a scoutmaster. So my rarest cards. The problem you run into is we can take the merit badges and say, okay, how many of this merit badge were issued in this year? That tells us a number for that card. However, you have no way of knowing where they filled out on this variety of card, this variety of card, this variety of card. There's just no way to know. You're never going to have exact numbers. However, you can get some rough estimates of scarcity by looking at how many were issued of that merit badge title in that year. So for me, I think my hardest card is probably my Insect Life. And it was the first year of issue, 1923, and there were 21 of that merit badge issued in that year. So this card would have been one of 21 cards issued in 23 for Insect Life. Sculpture, there were 38 issued. Stalking, there were 82, and those were in 1921 and 22 respectively. Now, Farm Home and Its Planning, that's one of the long titles. You would think, because it came out in 28, much later than the others, that it would be fairly common. You know, it's much later. Well, but it was the first year the merit badge was issued. So there were only 131 issued. So in 1928, 131 issued. The next year, because it was the second year, more people were aware of the merit badge, more people were able to earn it, over 1,600 were earned. So oftentimes, the first year a merit badge was issued, that card is going to be very difficult. Of course, there's also titles that just stayed hard. Not a lot of people earned them, and that's Sculpture, Citrus Fruit Culture. A 43 Sculpture, there were only 143 sculptures earned in that year. Citrus Fruit, in 1934, only 159 were earned. I can't really tell you definitively which cards are rare. I can give you some general rules of thumb. Earlier cards I would appreciate more than most later cards. If it's the first year one was issued, those are usually a little harder. The problem gets into some of the cards when you start talking about like the Schiff card, when you start talking about the McRae card. I mean, when a card may have only been issued for 2 months, you know, how many exist? We have no numbers on that to actually quantify it in any way that we can, you know, obviously they're not common, but how rare are they? I don't know. But I hope it at least puts a couple thoughts in your head about how to look at some of these cards. Now, I wanted to briefly go over how I store my cards. These cards, like a lot of paper items, if you're going to collect them and you're going to handle them and going to show them, you certainly don't want to damage them over time. I use Lighthouse Vario 2S pages. I get them off of Amazon. I put prices on here just so you could kind of see what this stuff normally runs. A lot of what I use is stuff that's also used for stamp collecting. You could just put them in those Vario pages and they could sit in those on their own and they'd be just fine. And the pages are designed for stamps. The other thing to do those, I use glassine envelopes number 5 size. You can get 100 of them for $10. I use those to store all of my duplicates and I put labels on them, kind of like how that is there. That's an example. I'm switching over all my collection. I've already done my first aid ones to approval cards with the top opening, the heavyweight. Those are more expensive. And, you know, it's $20 for 50 of them and I'm cheap. And every time I think about buying more, I just wince. So right now, all my dupes are in glassine, and then some of my collection's still in glassine until I eventually get shifted over. I will put a spreadsheet in the video description that has my first aid, how I had to format the spreadsheet to create the labels I'm about to show you. It's hard to create vertical labels. So these are 2 Vario pages, and then I put the top loading approval card holder thing in there. And then I make a label for the date on the left, and I put the number on the right. Now I collect by date and by variety. So I have a 1920 MBC 1-2-01, but I found a 1921 of the same card, but it's a 1921, so I wanted both. Of course, I got to make my life difficult. So that's how I collect. But I collect every variety of card from First Aid. I just pick my favorite merit badge, and that's what I do. Now, there's a couple examples of odd cards. You can have cards with multiple merit badges written on them, and examples there on the left. You can also have merit badges that are on cards that are vastly different in time period from when the merit badge was issued. So on the right is a card from Sheffield, Alabama, and it says it was issued 14th of March, 1935. However, it is an MBC-2-09. So it's from like 1928, 29, and yet it's a 35 merit badge. So there were some left over, and I doubt most of these places, once they got to the council, they did not necessarily operate on first in, first out. So, you know, if you had a stack in a drawer and you kept throwing the new on top, the old ones could get put to the bottom. And once again, this is why it's just impossible to know how rare or what rarity these cards are. There's just too many variables that you have no idea about. You know, how many merit badges in later dates were put on earlier cards? We don't know. How many were on council cards? We don't know. Just a lot of things to think about. So I tried to cover that pretty quickly. I saw a couple of comments in the chat. Does anybody have any questions? So this is the merit badge reference that Tim put together, which is just phenomenal. I printed this out and keep it with me when I go to shows. And a lot of this is what I use to help create this. And I will put a link to this in the video description. So there's nothing directly dated to 35. I would say overall, most of these dates are our best guesstimate. And a lot of it has to do with the signatures on the card and other small changes. It's very hard to know exactly when National ordered a specific card. But you'll be able to click on this link and download this as soon as I put the link in the video description.